Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I join you from sunny Mallorca, where I'm on a walking holiday at the moment. And the wonders of the internet that mean I can introduce Adrian and let him talk to you. I'm very pleased that Adrian's just agreed to talk to us. It's really about his journey to his contemporary ARPS, focusing on Greenland. And I think I shall pass you over to Adrian and let you take us through your talk, Adrian. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Right, thank you, Alan. And just hope that these things change when I press the button. I went to Greenland in end of August, beginning of September 2019, and spent a week in the capital of Nuuk, followed by a week further north at a town named Ilulissat. And when I went, I thought I would probably take photographs to try for a travel panel, but I found documentary, landscape, and contemporary were all equally possible. So this evening, we're going to spend the first 20 minutes or so looking at some of these travel, documentary, and landscape images, and then about half an hour looking at the images and how they came to produce a contemporary panel.
So Adrian, before you start,
yep.
I do apologize. Everyone, Adrian has a sort of natural break in the middle. In the meantime, if you've got any questions, please put them in chat, and Sean will gather them together and we'll ask them at the appropriate time. So sorry, Adrian.
That's all right.
To you again.
So we'll just see if these things change. They do.
Yep.
Yep. Good. Excellent. So before we look at the actual images, just a few notes about Greenland. This is a map of Greenland, as you can probably work out. Greenland is actually the largest non-continental landmass in the world. It's about 1,700 miles north to south. It's about 750 miles east to west, and so it's about 10 times the area of Great Britain. But the population is 56,000. The vast majority of that population are of Inuit ancestry, and the remainder are mainly Dutch. As you can see from the map, most of the land area is covered by an ice cap, and the rest is covered by snow for much of the year. And most of the population live down here in this coastal strip in the southwest. The islands used to be part of Denmark, but it became autonomous within the Kingdom of Denmark in 2009, and all the major settlements switched back to Inuit names rather than the Danish ones. So the capital, which had been Gotthab, became Nuuk. The United States has tried to purchase Greenland on a number of occasions, the most recent of which was in 2019 whilst I was there, which met with a lot of local anger and newspaper headlines, Greenland is not for sale, and in any case, we are not Denmark's to sell, which were displayed outside a US cruise ship, which had popped up at the time. There are no roads apart from within the settlements. Transport around is largely by plane. No one lives between the settlements marked on the map. And apart from a few flights from Iceland in the summer, the only way in is a daily wide-body flight from Copenhagen, which comes into an airport that's not marked on this map, but is about roughly where my pointer is. And then you fly onwards by small plane. That is going to change because at the moment, the runways here at Ilulissat and Nuuk are being extended. And the future of this one, which is built on permafrost that's melting, is uncertain. And so it's likely that a number of visitors to Greenland is going to rocket in perhaps 5 years' time or so. And where, if you think back 25 years ago, Iceland was esoteric, now everybody goes, and it's almost becoming cliched. Greenland could easily end up the same. So after that sort of introduction to the geography, we'll take a look at just a few pictures. These first two are just to illustrate the way you get in. Here's the wide body that arrives from Denmark every day, carrying passengers and essential goods and perishable goods. and there's one of the small planes, a de Havilland -8 200, which flies you around to wherever you're going. At the moment, it takes 6 or 7 flights a day down to the capital to deal with demand. And now on to things which are a little bit more interesting. So the first few images, I suppose, could in some ways be described as travel. They illustrate people going about whatever people are going about. This is an American tourist down at the waterfront in Nuuk, the capital, a population about 10,000, and you can see the buildings in the background, which are typically brightly coloured. The water there is about 0 centigrade. There were little icebergs. A group of local girls, teenagers, suddenly came along one day, stripped down to their underwear and jumped in, which took all the tourists a bit by surprise for a number of reasons. This is in the centre of Nuuk. There's a lot of modern construction. The building that you can see at the background is the National Arts and Culture Complex. And when I was there, it was showing the film, the name of which escapes me at the moment, but it was based on fishermen singing in Cornwall. Cornwall, of course, has a population 6 or 7 times that of Greenland.
Would be Fisherman's Friend. I
Fisherman's
think.
Friend, that's the one. Fisherman's Friend, the same as the throat sweets you can get. Some locals, typically smoking on the corner, and another slightly more market local, but they all wear trainers. They're obviously very practical wearing trainers. Interestingly, there are 2 or 3 different local brands of supermarket, and I think they're unique to Greenland. You'd expect them to be in the Faroes if they were a sort of Danish one, and they certainly aren't in the Faroes. And if you go to one of the towns like Nuuk, Ilulissat, Sissimut, then there tend to be little villages and settlements within 5 or 10 miles along the coast, and they're reached by local boats, which either charter or run local services. And this is a typical group of teenagers who are going off some sort of camping expedition. I actually went along with them and walked back. My wife, who does that sort of thing, walked there and back. This is in the capital of Nuuk. All the bus shelters look exactly the same as this. Whether the local buildings are new or old, the bus shelters all look rather second-hand and worn. It's almost as if they transplanted them. You get a set of new houses with a bus shelter just like that in the middle of them, as in fact we'll see later on. This is a branch of the other supermarket, and even although there's virtually no traffic, children still wander around wearing high visibility vests when they're on a school trip. Nuuk has a housing problem. The population has increased from about 1,500 to 10 to 12,000 in the space of 40 years. Not due to an increase in population in Greenland, but due to inward migration. And this has been addressed in various ways at different times. The latest way is to build what is effectively a new town 3 miles from the center of Nuuk, which has schools and supermarkets, but no medical facilities. All the medical facilities of whatever sort you want are all located in the National Hospital. Also on this, to start looking at is the rock in the background. Rock's going to become important later on. So if you notice that there is rock in the background and a young person, again, smoking, although as a young person, they're listening to their music while they wait for whatever they're waiting for. So in the center of Nuuk, the first way in which they tried to solve the housing problem was to build these low-rise flats in the 60s, which were apparently inspired by the work of Le Corbusier. And then they moved Inuit into them who wanted to butcher seals and dry fish, which they had to do using the baths and the balconies. They've now being demolished as unfit for purpose, and there was a great deal of nostalgia and exhibition work going on when I was there. And certainly one of the documentary things that could have been done was to do with the history of these blocks and the people who had lived in them. And there was certainly a lot of work of that sort going on amongst the local people. Here's a more general view of the blocks. That's actually a different one, despite having a very similar mural. And there's a whole row of these. It's not really what you expect to find in the middle of a city on a very large island with a very low population. But it's what's there. And as you can see, there were row upon row of them built in what is essentially the town centre. The main shops are literally 50 yards beyond the last of those blocks. But also sneaking in here in the back is something much newer, which we'll also see shortly. So they've all acquired murals along the way, and you can do photographic things with murals. And so today, as those blocks are being knocked down, the people who live in them have to go somewhere. And there is continuing inward migration into Nook. The population of Greenland is increasing slowly. There is actually a small amount of net inward migration from Scandinavia as well. So these are new houses being built in the unpronounceable place that begins with Q, about 3 miles from the centre of Nook, surrounded again by rock. And in fact, the airport is just at the top of that cliff. And to extend the runway, they had to actually do infill at the other end into the sea. The alternative was to build the airport about 15 miles away with access by boat. It might seem strange that you have a very large island with a very low population and everything is built in flats. And the reason is quite simply that there's no flat land. All the flat land where you could build, the area of Nook has gone. And so the only way you can go is up. Things are built directly onto the rock. You don't need any foundations. And so you end up with just a leveling section at the bottom, which gives you a natural basement, albeit with an uneven floor. Here's some more of these new low rise. Hopefully the cladding is fire regulation compliant. And again, the rock surrounds everything. And as they do everywhere, youths build ramps, despite the fact that there is skateboard park facilities just around the corner. But these new things come elsewhere. In the centre of Nook, there's a whole variety of new builds replacing properties from the late 1800s. And you could have done a photographic project on these. In fact, some of you will remember in the journal a couple of years ago, I think it was a contemporary panel that had photographs of this sort taken somewhere in the UK. And they come in all sorts of colours, but they're all medium, low rise. In this case, these are about 8 stories high. This is up in Ilulissat, the other place I went to, and again you can see, despite the fact the population here is much lower, there's a shortage of flat ground, and people tend to live in flats unless they've got lots of money. Some fish drying still occurs, and quad bikes and skidoos, you choose the time of the year and take the one that you want. If you're a bit more affluent, you can have a bungalow, again built straight onto the rock with a basement with an uneven floor, leveling it out to put the ground floor in. And these are, again, quite typical. A street scene in Ilulissat, typical colours. These are corrugated iron faced buildings. Sea at the back, and you can just about see some icebergs, and here's the Ilulissat power station in the background. And everywhere you go, there are building materials. Lots of the stuff is prefabricated in many ways, and panels that come in by boat, and they sit around and sometimes don't seem to get used. But it's a typical scene of an area that the tourists who go to Ilulissat tend not to go to. They tend to bypass it. And it's where the people that drive their taxis and work in the supermarkets tend to live. Switching attention slightly now, the reason tourists go to Ilulissat is because Ilulissat is next to a fjord about 40 kilometers long, which is full of icebergs. They carve directly off the ice cap, go into the fjord, and then get trapped because there's a bar at the end of the fjord, and until they melt sufficiently, they can't get out. But it's still the largest source of icebergs in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's thought that this is where the iceberg that the Titanic hit came from. These are some Americans off the cruise ship. And that's a panorama just to show you what the Ice Fjord looks like. This is the far side of the Ice Fjord, and it's about 15 kilometers away. You can go out and look at the ice. You can take trips around the ice. You can take trips to a local village that goes across the edge of the Ice Fjord, or you can go and look for whales. And this is the sort of scenery that you tend to see. The ice comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. It varies from day to day, depending what melting is going on. And you get these little effects at the bottom where, as the ice sort of tends to rise and sink, you get undercutting and sort of bands across. It's a place where a lot of halibut come, and the halibut live deep down at the bottom of the ice, and that attracts the whales. So this is a formal whaling boat taking people who are, as I was, on a modern whale hunt with cameras, but also taking photographs of the ice as we went along. So in fact, there was scope here for travel photography, there was scope here for the documentary with the buildings, the scope for landscape photography, although it's icescape. And everywhere you look on the icescapes, you find signs of life. Usually you get little birds sitting somewhere or flying around or on the surface of the water. You can't get too close. Clearly this bit here is going to fall off at some point. This bit's going to fall off at some point. Now here we are, some more little birds sitting on the surface of the ice. This here is going to fall off. And in fact, if you go up and sit on the cliffs and look at the Ice Fjord, occasionally you will actually see a large lump fall off and the waves it creates. You end up with ice caves. You end up with multiple banding here where the ice has been undercut. It's been in the water and gradually got melted. Little birds sitting on a floe. All sorts of strange sculpted shapes. Again, there's a bird there, they're always around. And you get a lot of whales, humpback whales and a few fin whales. These are humpback whales. They come up and feed here during our summer, and during our winter they go down to the equator. The humpback whales that live in the southern hemisphere do the same. They go towards the poles in the summer and up to the equator in the winter. But because the winter is the opposite way around to ours, the two separate populations hardly ever meet. So there's virtually no interbreeding between the northern humpback whales and the southern humpback whales. We didn't ever see one actually jumping out of the water, which they do occasionally. On different days, we saw the same whales. You could tell because they all have slightly different markings on them, and you came to recognize some of the markings on their sides. So let's go back again. So that's a place to take a very brief stop. That's a sort of a trawl through what it's like if you go to the capital of Greenland and to the primary destination for tourists, and the sort of buildings, locals, icescape, and such things you can see. So if there's any questions on what we've had so far, we've got about 3, 4, 5 minutes that we can look at them.
Yes, Adrian. I could see that was very much, you could sell this one as a travel kind of
Yes.
portfolio very easily, but also quite documentary, looking at the housing challenges and what they're doing and how they're fixing mistakes of the past. So I think lots of interest there. So a few questions and really comments. Alan's asked about the buildings. Are the buildings highly insulated?
I think the buildings must be highly insulated. It wasn't particularly cold when I was there. When I was in Nook, the temperature was about 16 by day. When we got to Ilulissat, the temperature did actually drop, and it had just started snowing at night as we left. And I did notice it had dropped to about -5 at night a week later. But by day, we were fortunate, it was largely sunny, and it was going up to about 10. But the building that we were in, at the time it was going down to 0 at night, the walls didn't look particularly thick, but it was clearly well insulated. It didn't get cold at all. So, I mean, yes, I mean, they would have to be well insulated.
Yeah. Then really, rock was obviously a big feature of many pictures. The rock was something, well, a bit like the ice, it's hard to avoid. But question from Alan again about, is Greenland part of the North American plate? I think it is.
It is indeed, because the plate runs through Iceland, so it is geologically it's part of the North American setup, and there's a bit more on, there's rather more on rock when we get to the ARPS panel.
You could sell that one then. Kind of definitely a landscape kind of option. Yeah, and then another question from Roger about what's the energy source at the power station? It's a good question.
That's a good question, isn't it? I think the energy source at the power station, based on observation rather than knowledge, is gas. And it must be imported if it's gas.
Yeah, if you have a photograph showing more of the station, I'll be able to tell you.
Yes, I probably have got one, but not that we're going to be looking at.
I
mean, everything is on the coast, and certainly lots and lots of stuff comes into Nook, and the airport, although where I showed you it was inland, there is actually a narrow inlet along which they can bring in the aviation fuel. Right. But I think it has got to be, it's got to be gas, or it's either gas or oil. It's one of the two.
Yeah, well, if it was oil, there'd be some very large tanks nearby.
That's right. Yeah.
And yeah, okay.
It's certainly unlike Iceland. It's definitely fossil fuel.
Yeah, not geothermal. No. Okay, and then some education from Sue Hutton about the rock. I think the Precambrian gneiss. I'm not so.
It's certainly Precambrian. I have a local a geological guru who tells me these things, and he told me it was Precambrian.
Good. Yeah, so plenty of discussion around almost like the logistics of just existing there. It's pretty tough.
Yes. I mean, if you live in the capital, it's all right. Lots of stuff comes in by boat. There's a university there. There's the hospital there. If you live anywhere else, then you're actually a long way from the major facilities. I think the only other hospital is in Ilulissat, and that's not going to have full facilities. There's an air ambulance at Beechcraft King Air that flies around taking people down to Nook.
Right. So when you were taking these photographs, I think in particular that there's somewhere there's people sitting, which could have been a sort of very obvious portrait style of photograph, but it's clear you must have made some choices to do different.
Yeah, I think I think I just naturally went most of the time for landscape. I tend not to shoot in portrait unless I have to, and then I tend to end up cropping.
I was also thinking about sort of like a street photography point of view, sort of isolating individuals, things like that. It was really, very much. No, this is the person, and this is where they are and everything else that's going on, was what I could see.
Yes. Yeah.
So another, what have we got here? Another question. Are they able to travel over the land, or is it always by sea or air? So we saw two examples, didn't we?
If you take the settlements that were marked on that map, there's no travel between them over land at all. Right. There's local travel by land, more in the winter by snowmobile than in the summer. In the summer, you tend to go by a boat around the coast, and then it all freezes up and you go over the snow on the snowmobile. But the only roads are within the settlements. And if you want to go between settlements, then you fly. And some of them it's a helicopter, some of them it's a 39-seater. There is a boat that runs along that southwestern coast, and it does one round trip south to north and back south again per week. And that takes about 60-70 people. But there aren't that many people to travel. The tourists tend to go in and go up to Ilulissat. Anyone to do with business and politics tends to fly in and go down to Nuuk, and then the locals fly around in between.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So perhaps go on and tell us how this mutated into.
Okay, so we'll move on and see how this mutated. So this is the statement of intent for a contemporary panel on the incongruity of existence. It reiterates what we've already heard. We've got the world's largest island, composed mainly of Precambrian bedrock, which is some of the oldest in existence, some of the ice cap, the coastal area, the number of inhabitants, and the fact that the buildings that have been constructed, the oldest of which are about 200 years old, stand in marked contrast to the ancient rock, as if they're placed onto its surface. In fact, as we discovered, the rock is actually used as the foundation in virtually every case. And the human architecture is hemmed in between the mountains and the sea and the ice cap. I didn't mention the ice cap in the statement of intent because I haven't got any photographs of it. And as soon as you mention it and you haven't got a picture of it, somebody complains. So you shut up if you don't have a picture. Unlike the bedrock, the human presence in Greenland is transitory, and the rock and the ice provide a constant reminder that whilst we come and go, the island remains. And the juxtaposition of the rock and the human habitation illustrates this truth, and a visual statement of incongruity and disparity, permanence and mutability. My intention was that the images captured the transience of human habitation in a land dominated by other facets of existence. Despite the vibrant colours provided by the trappings of modern life, and the fact that nearly all the buildings are multiple brightly coloured, the underlying rock remains unchanged. So that was what I set out to try and illustrate. At least that's what I told the assessors I was trying to do, and they must have agreed that I was vaguely successful, as the panel was a success. So this is the hanging plan for the 15 images. And what we're going to do is actually go and look at each of these images in turn and look at the original image which I took, and then the way in which it's been edited and primarily cropped to produce these 15. A couple of comments in general before we do that. The first is that I had 2 one-to-one online sessions, which were very helpful. And the one thing that we discovered in those is that we needed to get rid of the sky. If we're talking about human habitation and buildings and the rock which surrounds them, then the sky becomes irrelevant. And so, as we'll discover, all of these images in the bottom 2 rows, I think, have got sky in them originally, and it's been cropped out in every case. I thought I probably had to put some ice in somewhere, otherwise somebody was going to complain. And once you start putting in icebergs, you more or less have to have the sky unless you're doing those sort of close-up icescapes. And so there is sky in these top 3 images and just a little bit balancing it out in the two top corners. The other things I did was to get the colors of the sky, which was a general bluey grey in all three cases, but not a matching bluey grey, to be the same, which I was advised was quite important thing to do, as they were vaguely similar, but as opposed to distinctly different. And the other thing, which is something I decided on, which I was told wasn't necessary because I asked, was if you do a print and then you mount the print, sometimes there are things that you want to show, and there are other things which are then almost on the print because they're of their juxtaposition, but you can get rid of them by hiding them under the mount. If you then put up for a panel for viewing online, as all the assessments have been in recent times, and you put up exactly the same image, all those little artifacts around the edge that you've hidden away under the mount are going to appear. And I was told that if lots of little bits did appear around the edge, the assessors would check with the person in RPS House as to whether they were there on the mounted image. I decided not to take any chances, and so I actually, having printed and mounted, I then recropped the originals so that the images that I put out online digitally actually matched the visible section of the mounted image. So these images are actually exactly the same as what you would have seen with a mounted image, after it had been mounted, not before. So that we'll look at now at the first one. So this is the original version of the image in the top left corner. And it happens to be near the center of Nook. Anyone who knew anything about Greenland would know it had to be due to the size of the flats they're building. And there is plenty of rock about, but there's also lots of stuff over here, which is nothing really to do with modern buildings and nothing to do with rock. And there's all this sky, which was pointed out to me is fairly irrelevant if you want to do a contrast between the buildings and the rock. And so it ended up getting cropped down so that it really did focus in on the rock and the buildings. And here quite nicely, it draws attention to the fact that there's these older buildings, which is sitting in there in the foreground of this new one. What I hadn't thought about was the fact that if you're looking at 15 mounted prints on a wall, then you tend to see them all together, even if you're only looking at one of them. Whereas if you look at a hanging plant and then look at them individually, you tend to see the images much more as one-offs. And it hadn't really occurred to me, because all I knew about Greenland was what I had seen, was that for the uninitiated, looking at a panel on Greenland, the last thing they expected to see in the first image was a block of flats, especially as that if the statement of intent had told them what a big place it was and how few people lived there. So this was commented on by two, I think, of the people assessing. I think one of the actual assessors and one who was one of the trainees who was also there. So anyway, it's cropped down to focus very much on the rock and the juxtaposition between that and these buildings, which are probably 30s, 40s, and the new buildings, which are still very much under construction. Trying hard to get the verticals vertical and the horizontals horizontal, and this frame nicely, this crane nicely frames the top of the image. Moving across the top here, we have some quite classical buildings built straight onto the rock, and you can see how a level platform has been produced by building up with concrete from the bedrock with these uneven but built-in cellars that all of these properties have. Bit of ice in the foreground, and then when we crop it down, we focus in on this, and we focus in on some ice because we need some ice. I've desaturated the blue a bit on the ice because it was had a bit of a blue cast to it, and the sky has got adjusted to match the the other three images that we're going to come across to. This was the original version of the top center. That's my wife taking the photographs of these crosses. This was there had been a village here which has gone entirely, and all that is left are a few pieces of the burial ground. And this was approximately 7 or 8 miles walk to the north of a little settlement that you had to reach. Well, yes, a little settlement that you had to reach by boat. And if we then crop it down, we've obviously got to get rid of my wife. We don't want her, nor do we want the shadow of my hat. And the sky needs to get a bit unblue because it needs to match the others. And so we end up with this image. And we've got these are all icebergs, which, referring to what we've said earlier, came out of the Ice Fjord and are now gradually drifting north. And we need to remember, of course, that they're a lot bigger underneath the water than they are above. And the crosses, of course, illustrate the transience of human existence. And it's the only one which doesn't have any buildings in it. And the crosses sort of substitute for the buildings. The original version of another shot of Ilulissat. Lots of sky, which we don't need all of that sky. The rock is either dark here or not actually very dominant. It's there, but you need to look for it. So we cropped that one down, and now the rock in the middle is much more prominent. You've also got the ice. We need some ice somewhere. And these buildings are all of a similar sort of construction, using a mixture of prefabrication and wooden panels. And then finally, top left on this top row, the image that actually didn't get really changed very much at all. All that happened to this one was it just had its verticals tweaked about a little bit. And so it ends up like that. But in common with all the flats, and this is nothing to do with the panel at all, the washing hangs out of the window on sunny days and off the veranda, because no one thought about how these people were going to dry it. And they presumably don't want to use tumble dryers when they don't have to. But it does illustrate very nicely in a lovely diagonal the way in which access here is built straight onto the surface of the rock. This in fact is in Ilulissat, and there's a lot of building straight onto large scale rock with access along wooden boardwalks and steps. So moving down onto the second row, here this is the original version. We have lots and lots of rock. We've got these new pods, which are actually, each pod is a room at the local hotel, at a little settlement to the south of the Ice Fjord that you reach by boat. And here's a much older building, and we crop it down just a little bit and accentuate the older building and these modern ones and their south-facing solar panels. There's some ladies here up underneath some towels. And clearly you can't expect hotel guests to walk across the grass, so they walk across the boardwalk, and there's a quite old building just off left. But again, as far as the panel is concerned, it's cropped down. We've got all this rock around, and we've got both new and an older building decaying, showing us the transience of the human habitation. This was in the middle of nowhere, walking along sort of 6 miles from a small settlement at the end of one of the boat runs, and Ilulissat at the southern end, and in the middle were these little huts, which I think are little summer houses of one sort or another. Plenty of rock, but we crop it down, get rid of the sea and the sky, and focus on the human habitation, its colours, the rock, and in fact the way in which the vegetation, adopting these lovely orange reds, actually works in very well with the buildings that have been constructed. Several of the assessors really liked this one. They said it was wonderful the way I had pictured it, with the buildings almost sliding off sideways on the rock, which was news to me, as that hadn't occurred to me at all. But they liked it, so I'm quite happy to take credit for it and say what a wonderful idea I had. We've actually seen that building before in one of the others. It's up in Ilulissat. It's a sunny day. People are hanging their washing out of the windows. Here's the rock in the foreground, but we've got a bit of sky in there, and we've got this building at the side that we don't really want. So we'll crop it. And here it's not so much that the building is built onto the rock directly, although we can tell it is because we know how the buildings work. It's that it is sort of surrounded by the rock. Between the street and the building is this lump of bedrock. The problem with this picture in getting it ready was quite obvious, in that you have to get all the verticals and the horizontals all lined up. And this lamppost was only just in the original image, and so you have to be very careful not to lose any parts of it. My daughter said to me, "You can't go around photographing people's washing like that, Dad," she said. So I told her that yes, I could, because that's what we did. But she wasn't very pleased. This is almost, in many ways, just a single pictorial shot. Oh, look, here's an oil tank, so it must be oil. This is in Ilulissat. It's not near the power station, but it certainly looks like an oil tank, so there must be something going on with it. But again, typical coloured buildings, all built onto the rock. And if we crop it down, and that, you can see that actually this one got a bit darkened and saturated. Just in case you're interested, this building at the back is the second largest hospital in Greenland, up at Ilulissat. And then finally on this row, the original image here, which was not taken with any thoughts to the contrast between the buildings and the rock at all. It was focusing very much on this youth who was walking out of the bus shelter, having been waiting for a bus that quite clearly hadn't come, outside the secondary school in the new, recently built and still under construction area of Nuuk, the unpronounceable one with the name that begins with Q. But in fact, I cropped it down to focus very much on the contrast between this modern building, which is already showing signs of age in the way in which the surface of the wood is changing, and the rock behind it. So we get rid of the youth because he's superfluous to what we're trying to achieve. The top of the bus shelter gives us a sense of perspective, as does the light fitting, and then we end up with a contrast between this modern building, albeit with its wood that's fading already, and the rock behind. Just going back to something I said earlier, nothing to do with this panel, you can see how, although this is a nice new area, the bus shelter looks as though it's been transported in from an earlier age and is second hand. And now onto the bottom row, a hut that's clearly seen better days and may even not be in use anymore, surrounded front and back by rock. And we don't need the sky, so we'll crop it down and end up with this. One of the assessors said, "There's not much rock in this, is there?" Which I thought, well, what is this? And what is this here as well? But there we are. They couldn't have been too upset. A different sort of photograph. The bridge clearly has a temporary structure to it. In fact, the bridge was put there by the US Air Force. This is adjacent to the large runway where the wide body comes in from Copenhagen every day, which will probably disappear when the other runways are built. And it's the original US Army / Air Force bridge that they built across this river of glacial meltwater. I'm not quite sure why there's a bus going up here, because the road stops after half a mile and there doesn't seem to be anything there. So unless there's something going on that wasn't apparent, I don't know. And all these plethora of road signs, which are largely unnecessary. However, it's a transitory nature of this bridge, which is clearly a temporary structure. And that's the image actually as printed. A bit more contrasty, a bit brighter. This one is also adjacent to the runway in the middle of nowhere, as I describe it. But we didn't need the sky. We didn't really need the telephone wires, although I suppose they do illustrate that in this day and age, you can't, when these things tend to go underground, you can't put them underground if all you've got is bedrock. But clearly they still think there's some form of construction going on. Otherwise they wouldn't have these girders of some description. And we crop it down and we end up with a focusing on the transience of the building and the rock in the background. And of course, again, bright colors, temporary buildings. This is the third image, which is next to the runway. And you can see these are clearly all concrete bolted together ex-US Forces buildings. The airport is just off shot on the left. And we crop it down. We get rid of the sky because we don't need the sky, and we end up with the juxtaposition between the rocky surfaces, the trappings of what are clearly prefabricated accommodation, and the posts, which are slowly decaying back into the earth from which they didn't come because the wood was obviously imported. Nothing to do with the portfolio, but it just occurs to me, I should have mentioned earlier on, that right up in the very north of Greenland, there is still a US base at a place called Thule, where the Americans do secret things and hopefully pay Greenland rather than Denmark itself some form of rental for it. It's also the only place that the wide body can divert to if for some reason something goes wrong at the main runway. The good thing about the main runway is it only ever gets closed due to fog about twice a year. It has a very, very good weather pattern. And then the final image, which in some ways starts life as just a pictorial image of two buildings of indeterminate age, probably rather more modern than they look at first sight. This one's clearly had something added into it. But again, they're built onto a concrete base, which is directly onto the rock. Clearly there's some sort of access here, which has been covered over. Litters of various ages are scattered around. And so we crop it down to focus very much on the rock. We can actually see this isn't concrete anymore. It's obviously wood that's still surrounding the concrete that was must have been poured in there at some point. But the rock is here, and the buildings sit on top of it, and their age is indeterminate. Things like this age very quickly. So they had a look at all the pictures, and they had a bit of a chat, and most of them seemed to like it. One person on the panel decided that they didn't really like it. They seemed to be sort of trying to find faults wherever they could. But the chairman gave a very clear steer, without being too explicit, that they were totally on the wrong track and should be ignored. And the panel was successful, and I was awarded my ARPS as a result. And that is the end So after that, the last slide is the acknowledgements and thanks slide, which Alan sent me. So we'll leave
Don't put it up just
no,
yet.
so we'll leave it at this point for the questions.
Yes, I think there was. Let's perhaps start way back in the questions. Really, there was a question about: did you do much additional research? That was from Joshua. Did you do research into the architecture in terms of discovering a bit more about the construction methods, or was that really on the basis of what you were seeing because of the construction that was happening at the time?
It was very much on the basis of what I was seeing. The only because there were buildings in all different sorts of stages of construction, and some of the older ones you could go and give a poke to. The only ones where I actually, it's not supposed I did research, but the research was presented to me, was in the National Museum, and when I went into an exhibition on the original now being demolished Le Corbusier blocks and their construction and the social effects it had had on the people that were moved into them.
Good. I think I'll go to the questions about cropping. There was a number of different things. Joshua asked questions about why did you simply not crop when shooting rather than afterwards, and Roger is asking, did you take the images with the intention of cropping them, or was that something which came afterwards, perhaps with some of the advisors' input and feedback? And then a question that's perhaps on many other people's minds as well is what about the cropping versus the quality of the files that you had then for printing and for the digital images?
Yeah.
So a bunch of linked questions.
A bunch of linked questions, yes. Okay. I suppose the first thing to say is that although you're supposed to write your statement of intent and then go and take the pictures, these pictures weren't actually originally taken with the intention of looking at the contrast between the human habitation and the rock. They were taken as a range of images that could possibly be used for travel and possibly and essentially just for my own personal interest and because of the patterns that you get on the modern buildings and these different buildings. And so when I came to producing the eventual statement of intent, it was therefore necessary to crop, and certainly where the sky got cropped out, that was a result of the one-to-one discussions. Cropping, I mean, is interesting. My take on cropping is that if you go back to when people were doing photojournalism in black and white, then they tended to just be using a standard lens, take lots of black and white photographs, and then you crop it down to show the image that you want. However, if you're taking 35mm color slides, which is what I did from 77 to 2009, you very much need to get the image that you want on the slide because that's what you're going to project. You don't have the luxury of being able to choose the bit that you want very easily, as we can do today. And so when I started doing digital, I found I was shooting what I thought I wanted, and then later realizing that actually what I also wanted was something just off the edge of the image. So wherever now, I always tend to shoot more than I think I'm going to need unless I'm constrained, and then crop it down to give me what I want. In practice, the quality isn't going to suffer because if you're shooting with something like, well, in my case, it's 24 megapixels, but let's say you've got 20 to 30 megapixels, then you can crop down to a quarter of that and easily print an A3 print. And if your original, if you've got a decent lens and you haven't got any camera shake in, that's going to be a perfectly good enough image to print off at A3 even. And these are printed off effectively at A4. They're on A3 paper, but they're almost an A4 size image in the middle of it. And even where I've cropped down to a quarter, or in fact in one or two of these cases a bit less, you're still printing 5-6 megapixels, and we only have to go back sort of 20 odd years and people were printing 3 megapixels and getting nice sharp images.
Yeah, indeed. Most of my A panel, I think, was 12 megapixels.
Yes. My L panel was all 12 megapixels and cropped down in some cases to a third of that.
Yeah. So really another good question, a technical one from Alan. Did you think about using longer lenses to play with perspective between the rock and the buildings?
I did. I mean, all of these images on this panel were shot with on a DX format with a 16 to 85 millimeter lens, zoom lens. So effectively, if we're talking 35 millimeter, we're talking something like 24 to 105, 110 thereabouts. And they were shot across a range of those focal lengths, and some of them are so shot with effectively what's 100 millimeter lens on a also on a normal 35 millimeter. The only other lens I had taken with me was a 70 to 300. I could have used it on some of these and played around. In practice, the only images I took with it were those of the whales, some of the pictures of the whales. So yes, I could have gone around, and I suppose if I had had longer, then I might have done that. I was combining a holiday with a photographic shoot, and certainly once my wife joined me for the second week, I was a bit more constrained than I had been in the first. My wife, I should have said, went out before I did, and she did a long distance walk along the Arctic Circle, taking 12 days with 2 other people through the, literally through the middle of nowhere. Once you set off, you might meet a few other people, but there was no civilization or habitation along the way. So my time in Nook, I could do what I liked. My time in the Lurasat, I was a bit more constrained and had to crop her out of this image, for instance.
That's yes, nice when you get a bit of both, let's say.
Yes,
Time
yes,
yourself
yes.
to do it and family time. Quite lucky to do that.
Yeah.
One thing I've noticed, and you did mention it in one of the images, the second row, second across, the lovely match between the colours, tones in the buildings and what's going on in the vegetation on the rocks. Now, the way that the pictures look together is this, the so-called final image of all of them together, the way the tones work out. Did you have to work hard to adjust the tones other than the skies? And,
no.
And did you have a strategy for trying, or a process you went through to try and get this sort of sequence right, so you had a balance of the tones?
The tone, apart from getting these 3 skies to be pretty close, because they weren't sufficiently different beforehand to be demonstrably different, so I had to get them close enough. But apart from that, all the tones are as they weren't adjusted. So these 2 are naturally the same color of the sort of dying grass as we move into the autumn, and the browns in these are that they are all just as it was. My wife did learn what all of these different plants were on her walk, and she also started picking berries at random, which was a bit worrying. I don't know what color these were earlier in the season. Certainly on some of the low hills that we walked up, there was vegetation that looked similar to this that was still green. So it could well have been that if I'd taken these images 3 months earlier, that the colors of the ground would have been somewhat different.
Yeah, so quite opportune.
So in one sense, it's opportune, yes.
Yeah, it's very good. Spotted a technical question from Roger: is DX and APS-C? Yeah, that's what Nikon call their APS-C sensors.
Yeah, DX is what Nikon call the whatever it is. It's the
crop sensor.
It's the crop sensor. It's the one that's next down from the full 35 millimeter.
Yeah, so FX is their full frame, and DX.
Yeah, that's right. And DX is the first one down. Yeah. So it's bigger than the Panasonic and smaller than the full 35 millimeter size.
Yeah. And again, we've got some more useful education from Sue about the rocks.
Ah.
It's worth reading. It's not so much a question. But yeah, that's it from questions point of view. Does anybody else have any more questions? I think I think what I've learned from this is that it's perfectly possible to go back through a set of images that you weren't quite sure they would fit a brief, and make them fit a brief by clever use of cropping to force perspectives and to force the viewer to see something. I think in particular, one that's I did like the way the rocks on the first row, fourth image, the rocks were brought in from being there, but not really a big focal point, to, wow, it's, you know, yes, it's on the rock. That made a world of difference.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Sean. And I think it does illustrate that if you think about the images that you've got, you can actually tell a story that's not necessarily the one that existed when you first took the images.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, I suppose I'd say that when I went, most of the images I took were with the intention that they could be part of a panel. It wasn't necessarily going to be this panel, but they were taken with that intent, and therefore they all had, I suppose, in that sense, inherent within them the potential. That they weren't just a random set of images.
Absolutely. Right, well, I think we can go on. Time is running out, so can we have the next slide then, Adrian? It's a bit strange that Adrian has this slide, because it's thanking him very much for an illuminating walk through his ARPS. I do find what we've just been discussing actually quite important. And also, can I say thank you very much to Sean Goodhart for, as ever, collecting the questions for us. And indeed for my wife, Anne, who's not mentioned on here, but who started the thing off because I happened to be away in Mallorca. The next talk in our series next month will be with Simon Hill, the president of the RPS, who's going to talk to us on the 15th of November at the same time as our current talk. And then in December, we're going to have to shift time frames to a Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, because we'll be listening to Len Metcalf from Sydney, who talked at the AGM. So if you saw the AGM, you will hear that talk again, but I think it's well worth a second viewing. And if you didn't listen to the AGM talk, you're in for a real treat. So thank you very much again, Adrian. It's been a pleasure, and we'll end it there for everybody. So thank you very much, and good night.